You are listening to the Drunken Pen Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Caleb James. With me today, Spencer, the Tennessee Toblerone Tyrant Church, lording over the delicious chocolates.
Yeah, I'm a chocolate guy. I have a bit of a sweet tooth.
That's a weird one. We'll talk about this next episode because I'm assuming we're not going to have a guest next week, but you just got accepted into a publication.
Yes.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
We will celebrate you
next week.
Or if they decide that actually it's garbage and
yeah,
it was a mistake.
They get another email like, oh, sorry, that wasn't meant for you.
Yeah. Today we have a special guest. I'm sure his name's in the title, so it's not really a surprise. But today's guest is a senior editor at Stat-O-Rec magazine, the fiction editor of The American, a magazine based in Rome, and a regular contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. He's also the author of the novels Enemy Combatant, Tyler's Last, and The Cannibal of Guadalajara, which won the 2009 Gaval Press Novel Award and was nominated for the National Book Award. Here to discuss his latest book, Master Lovers, published by Outpost 19, is David Winter. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you so much for having me.
To circumvent a long preamble, I'm just going to read the book synopsis because sometimes we get people on, and I do one of two things. I say, hey, can you tell us about the book? And then it's like, they don't want to do that. Or two, I do a very shitty job of trying to describe what I've read of the book. Usually I don't have time to read all the work, so I only read a few chapters, but I don't want to butcher it. So I'm going to go ahead and read your synopsis here.
That's great, yeah.
Get everybody up to speed. While clearing out his great-aunt's Midtown apartment after her death, author David Winter discovered artifacts of her storied existence. Notes from opera houses, love letters, and artifacts from the Middle East of the 1930s. His aunt Dorle had been a co-founder of Angel Records and a prominent figure in the mid-century classical music world. But the more he learned about her world, the more complicated her story became. A twisted puzzle full of love and fascism, a record of a young woman grappling with her attraction to lovers with hair-raising political ties. A powerful work of family discovery rooted in a bygone Midtown Manhattan and involving artists and politicians from around the world. And you described this as a fictional memoir?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, so flashback 20 years, my great aunt dies. And actually, little detail I barely included in the book is she lived in an apartment in Midtown Manhattan, this big old apartment that was given to her in the 50s by RCA, actually, because she and her husband worked for RCA. It's kind of like RCA housing, this kind of mid-century modern apartment. She died in 2000. My mom, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and my mom would come up from Charlottesville and stay at my aunt's apartment from 2000 to 2010 before my mom's Parkinson's really got bad and she could no longer do that. And so my dad decided to sell the place. And my great aunt had been, as my little, promo that you so kindly read, Caleb, suggests. She was in classical music. She knew Maria Callas. She knew Leonard Bernstein. And I was given the job by my dad of clearing out her apartment. And I was hoping for stuff from famous people, actually. I was kind of looking for celebrity letters. I didn't know who they could be. I found Diana Ross in her address book. I don't think she really knew Diana Ross, but you never knew. I mean, and so I'm clearing out her apartment and I find all these letters that are obviously hidden, that they are not from famous people. They're from men. I don't know who they're from. And I start reading them. And the first group of them I start reading, there were 200 or 300 of them, was from this guy named John Carter. And obviously you can't find a more common name than John Carter.
Yeah.
How many John Carters are there in America? Millions.
It'd be hard to Google that one.
It'd be hard to Google that one. Yeah. He wasn't the Canadian flying ace because that guy died in 1918 and these letters from 1930. So finally, she wrote his middle name someplace. It was John Franklin Carter. And I found out that he was a New Dealer. Meaning he worked with FDR, and he wrote murder mysteries, kind of like a mid-level government bureaucrat in the 30s is kind of the gist I got. And he was married, and my great aunt and he met on a boat coming over from Paris to New York in the early 30s. And they had this big affair, hiding it from the wife. It went on for, 5 years. It's full of drama and stuff. And I didn't really know who this guy, John Carter, was, except for his Wikipedia page, his New York Times obit, the FDR stuff. It seemed kind of low key, really. But then it's actually my wife who just did this real simple thing that didn't occur to me to do, which was to put the guy's name in the New York Times archive. And we found a story from 1932 in the Times that said that this John Franklin Carter had been deputized by Hermann Goering to run not a quote unquote Hitlerist, meaning Nazi, but for some reason they use the term Hitlerist party against FDR.
Ooh.
And I should say my great aunt was a Jew.
I was going to say, was she aware of this?
I don't think she was ever. That's the crazy thing. I don't think she was ever aware of this. There was no reason to think she was, except it was pretty creepy. And I ended up, in my very kind of inept, fumbling way, researching this guy. And I ended up finding out that wasn't exactly true. But I found that this guy, John Franklin Carter, actually has an archive. He's not really famous enough to warrant an archive, but he had some little archive in Cheyenne at the University of Wyoming, Cheyenne. And they sent it to me. And I got his wife's diary from 1932. And they had gone to Germany. They had met with Goering. They went to see Hitler speak. John Franklin Carter's wife said it was quite a good show. She was entertained by it. It's weird if you imagine, like, you've all seen the pictures of Hitler speaking. And
yeah.
I mean, if you speak German, it might be a little bit different. It just looks weird and terrifying, obviously. Like, this guy's like,
extremely aggressive. Yeah.
Fairly aggressive. Yeah. And she thought it was quite a good show. Anyway, that led me on this kind of voyage of discovery. And I also, after having found John Franklin Carter's letters, I just started ransacking her apartment, really, and found 4 other sets of hidden love letters they were all from different men. They were all from, say, like 1932 to 1937. 3 out of 5 of them were married, and they were kind of all at the same time, too. At one point, she left this guy, John Franklin Carter, in America. They were having some trouble, and she was going to go meet this other lover of hers, a guy named George Asfar, who was an antiquities dealer from Syria, and she was going to meet him in Damascus. And she hooks up with a British police officer in charge of a large part of British Mandate Palestine on the ship. So she's leaving her married lover in New York, meets this unmarried. Actually, these 2 other guys were the 2 unmarried guys, so maybe it's not so bad. But,
yeah.
So she hooked up with him on her way to a 3rd lover. So it was this crazy thing. And my great aunt was, warm, friendly, old lady. By the way, Caleb, thank you. You're one of the very few people who's pronounced your name right.
Oh,
It's an old German. Maybe it's a German Jewish name. I don't know. But it's Dorle, and you got it right. Everybody says Dorle. I mean, yeah. But she was a nice, warm, sweet person. And by the time I met her, when I was born in the mid 60s, she was happily married to my Uncle Dario, an Italian Jew who she met in the early 40s. And it was weird to learn of all these love affairs. And these men were strange and difficult characters. And to go back to your initial question, I'm sorry to go off on this tangent about the whole book. You had said I'm using fiction. I had 5 sets of love letters, just the men's words. And so to tell the stories of these affairs, I had to do a lot of making shit up, basically.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question is how was, what was fiction and what was not. So yeah, to tell a story from just letters, that would require some imagination and just to make it more entertaining for the audience. We'll probably jump around here, but one of the interesting things you just brought up was, looking at your great aunt when you knew her as an older woman and then just, an old woman. It's almost the same view that you could have with World War II and like the Nazis, because, this is about 1930s Nazis, right. John Carter and stuff. That was different. So we usually just view Nazis from what they are, post World War II. But pre World War II is a little different. There was a lot of Americans that were actually in support of that. And it wasn't
Absolutely.
necessarily a bad thing because they weren't established as the evil assholes they
Yeah.
became.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure it was there, but it wasn't, it was, we see it like in modern
You
America
didn't know
now.
about it.
Yeah.
You didn't know about it. Yeah.
So you get the same view though as like, my great aunt lived this crazy whirlwind life. She was a cosmopolite. She was all around the world, globetrotting or meeting people and whirlwind romances. And you just know the sweet old lady. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's interesting because there's
Yeah,
so
it's-
much we miss just from the passing of time.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, in the early 90s, I would go have drinks with her in New York. And at the time I was I was like in my late 20s. And I was like finally an adult. And she would drink. She always drank the same thing. She always had gin and tonics. And she smoked Benson Hedges cigarettes. Have you seen those cigarettes? They were like the fancy cigarettes of that era. And she had like the fancy gin of that era, Bombay gin, which is no longer the fancy gin.
No.
It's kind of rock gut gin, really. But she would tell me these crazy stories. And like she told me that her husband, my uncle Dario, had left her for a while for an old girlfriend back in Rome. She told me lots and lots of stuff. So in a way, like getting to know her in that second incarnation when I was no longer a child, when I was like in my late 20s, wasn't that surprised. It's a little less surprising than if I had only had my childhood memories of her. Like she was out there. She had interesting experiences.
Well, I think it was in the first chapter you mentioned when you're going through her stuff. I think you saw a picture of her with Mick Jagger. Was that fiction or was that an actual picture you saw?
Yeah, that was an actual picture. Yeah. If I were a better organized person, or I would just like show it to you and stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, no, she's the story she told about it, though, I think is probably fiction. She said that he was consulting with her about what to name his daughter, about the name of his daughter. Like they met in some party. It was like the Studio 54 era, though I'm sure it wasn't Studio 54. Like my great aunt wasn't that much of a part. But and she said that he asked her for baby name advice.
I don't know. That's just odd enough that it could be true, though.
Yeah.
Like it's so specific of a thing, like of a request.
The only thing I know is true is he definitely didn't listen, because I think the child that he had his name something like Elizabeth, and I know my great aunt I don't know, she would have suggested some weird ass name. She wouldn't have suggested Elizabeth. So
What inspired you to write this kind of story? Was it just because you found those letters and it just sparked something? It was like, oh, there's something here that's very interesting and unique. Or is it just one of those things where it's like, my aunt, it was really cool, and I want, your imagination starts just running with it.
I think my imagination just started running after I read these stories. I mean, she did have a pretty amazing life. I knew that. And way back in the day, her friends were always trying to get her to write some kind of memoir. And then she never was interested, and she never did. So that book was never written. And so I thought about trying to write it before. But when suddenly these letters landed in my lap, it seemed like the way into it. Kind of a surprising, something that's not just telling her life story, that's going to be surprising.
Did you have any worries about how your family might view the work, or is it just one of those things where it was because it's a fictional memoir that they could just take it with a grain of salt if anything was, because not everyone wants to think of their great aunt or grandma or somebody having all these romances when they were young.
Right. That's a good question. I mean, my person who would have been affected by it was my dad, because my dad was really close with her. Like my dad felt like his own parents weren't great parents, and he felt like she was kind of like his real mom in a lot of ways. And he was very supportive of it. The love affairs didn't seem to bother him. He seemed like he was a little proud of her, maybe for I think that she had many more love affairs than he ever had, and more pride than judgment. But he died 2.5, 3 years ago, and before the book got accepted for publication, and I kept, playing with it and changing it. And some of the Nazi stuff, the darker associations of some of her lovers, I kind of found out later. And it's a little bit of a different book coming out after his death. I don't know whether I would have made it different, but I definitely felt freer to to pursue some of the darker, more unpleasant things about her, because my dad really did idealize her as like the perfect person.
Yeah, that's one of those things when you're writing about actual people, especially if they're related to you, is just the view that others might have on them. And, even if it's true, certain truths come out, they might not be able to accept it, or they might harbor some
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
anger towards you.
that's really true. I mean, what everyone on that side of my family, they just didn't have a lot of children, so there just weren't a lot of people around. Who I wondered about more was the families of her lovers, particularly John Franklin Carter. If they're out there, would they be hurt and upset by that? And I obviously, it didn't stop me from writing the book. Probably, it's a small press. It's not like there was billions of copies of millions of people reading it. It's small. It's all kind of small potatoes, less likely to make the kind of imprint that would influence somebody else. But I did wonder about, John Franklin Carter's, his daughter, various relatives, and I was sort of trying to look them up and maybe like tell them about the book, but then that began to feel a little stalky. So I didn't do that. I sort of like left that alone. If they happen to chance across it, they'll chance across it, and they'll. I mean, if you look at this guy, John Franklin Carter, like I said earlier, the Wikipedia, New York Times obit, he seems like one thing. The more you delve into him, the more he seems like another thing. And one later thing that after my dad died and I kept revising the book is there was this podcast that Rachel Maddow did like a couple of falls ago about Nazis in the United States in the lead up to World War II. She mentions this guy, George Virek, who she called the top banana of Nazis in America before World War II. And George Virek, from one of the letters to my great aunt, was friends with this guy, John Franklin Carter. And I got really curious about, who his Nazi ties and how, and I consulted with this historian who was the person who kind of worked on this Rachel Maddow podcast series, and he was kind enough to write me back. And he suggested getting John Franklin Carter's FBI file. And eventually, it's weird, actually, my stupidity. Like I made a request with Freedom of Information Act request for the FBI file, and they gave me the option to expedite it. And I was like, I want this fucking file. I want to know. But they rejected the whole thing because expediting it means, I didn't know this, but like if you think your neighbor is about to blow up the Capitol, then you get it expedited.
Yeah, that raises red flags when you do that.
Right. It's just like learning about this guy dead for like 55 years. It's not. So I applied again. I didn't make the mistake of expediting. They gave it to me, and I just realized more and more about this guy that was stranger and stranger. And I again, you asked me about my family, and I'm talking about his family, but I wonder like what his family was. I mean, for one thing about him that I learned from the FBI file that actually I saw in other places is that, and this is this weird, scary thing, that after Pearl Harbor, FDR wanted the Japanese American community in California to be investigated. He wanted to know if they were loyal or not. This is obviously the lead up to the internment camps for Japanese Americans. And John Franklin Carter had was actually working for FDR as a spy. Because FDR wasn't satisfied with the State Department, wasn't satisfied with naval security. He was hiring all his own spies at the same time. It's a weird story about him. And he actually hired John Franklin Carter as one of his spies. And when it came to the question of Japanese American loyalty, he asked John Franklin Carter, my great aunt's lover, and John Franklin Carter dispatched this guy Munson to California, came up with this thing called the Munson Report. And the Munson Report actually basically was a racist document, as anything in that era probably would be. But despite its racism, it vouched for Japanese American loyalty. But this is according to what I read in a book about this. John Franklin Carter wrote this very hasty, inaccurate sort of executive summary of it, which is probably all that FDR read. And the executive summary did not really vouch for Japanese American loyalty. So, I mean, it probably is not really true, but in a certain sense, my great aunt's lover may not have been dispatched by Goering to run against FDR, but might be in some way responsible for the internment camps of Japanese Americans because of the bad summary he did.
Right. You have to wonder if just Dorle's association with some of these people could have had a negative effect on her life. Because at that time, it was the Red Scare, communism was the big like if you were even associated with communism, the government's watching
Right,
you and going
right.
after you. I mean, Hemingway, like they were
Ye
watching him.
yes, absolutely.
And obviously, like the Nazi stuff after the war started, the tide shifted. So if you're associated with Nazis, now they're looking at you. And
Right.
then she also had ongoings with like people in the UK. So I think you had like a member of the Black and Tan, and then
Yes, yes,
someone in Ireland, which is the
yes,
opposition. It's just like
yes,
how
yes,
many
right.
people could have been like she could have gotten a bad way at any point, you
She
know?
definitely could've, she definitely could've. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that for some reason or other, she was never on anybody's radar enough to cause her problems, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, she could've, but you were talking about, like, the Red Scare and stuff like that, it's kinda sad and comic at the same time, like, I would John Franklin Carter's FBI file, it's like 40 pages, and, by the way, I'm not a big fan of J. Edgar Hoover, obviously. He seemed like a raging,
I don't think there's a
asshole.
lot of
But
Hoover fans out there.
no, but the one thing that John Edgar Hoover that made me respect him is that he called John Franklin Carter's bullshit. Like, he couldn't stand John Franklin Carter, and I think he was right because John Franklin Carter was just, like, full of himself, like but anyway, to go back to the Red Scare thing, at the end of John Franklin Carter's life, the very last entries in this big FBI file is suddenly people were reporting on him for having had sort of like lefty ties when he was really, really young. It's like suddenly you could tell in the FBI file just the McCarthy era. Suddenly things switched, and suddenly
Mm.
like World War II is over, and like some minor. He was not a communist in any way. He was closer to a fascist than a communist. But suddenly, like they weren't going to bother to investigate him. He was old, but it was
Yeah.
interesting to think the tide turned.
Do you know that happened to a lot of people in that era,
It
actually, though,
did. It really did. Yeah.
and good for them. Do you know how the relationship ended with him?
Thank you for asking that question. That's a really great question, and there are different versions of that based in the letters. One letter that John Franklin Carter wrote her was all about like he was a really pretentious letter, and he was a pretentious. He was the guy. I mean, he was ending things. He couldn't stand it. Like the stuff that she was doing that he doesn't really refer to really angered him, and he was just I'm making this big decision that I will regret for the rest of my life, but I'm not going to change my mind. It's over. He wrote her his name was John, but he wrote her a Dear John letter. Then I found an entry in my a letter, I'm sorry, that my great aunt wrote her own mother, saying that she realized that John Franklin Carter's wife had been institutionalized because she was having like what they used to call a nervous breakdown, partially because of his affair with her, my great aunt, and that my great aunt was ending things because she couldn't stand to hurt that, John Franklin Carter's wife was hurt so much. And actually in this letter, she describes meeting John Franklin Carter's wife in New York City at some point, and just the two of them talking, and that's how it ended. So I don't know. Great question how it ended. At least two versions of it.
Well, that's a tough thing from letters. Even if you got her side of the letters, it's still it's the he said, she said. So you're
It's
not
the he
really
said, she
gonna
said.
ever get the full story unless some
No.
outside party
Yeah.
was witness to something.
You never
Yeah.
hear the responses or the what was said or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Which I mean, this will be a huge digression we won't get into, but that just makes you think like the post-tech era, all
Yeah.
that stuff is probably recorded. So nobody will like in the future when someone's writing, maybe a future relative's writing a book about you or
Mhm.
something, they would actually have probably a lot more information. It
Oh
might
my
not
God, they would have everything. Yeah.
be hard to write a fiction.
It'd be on an old
Right, it's all-
CD. They're like, what is this?
What is this
It's
archaic?
it's so true. Yeah. It's a great point.
What I am interested about, like the black and tan stuff, because it seems, I
Yes.
mean, it's kind of the catch of the book. She went after these very polarizing figures, like,
She did.
and that's the thing too. It wasn't just a fascist or the opposite of, like, it was just the gamut. Like, it didn't seem like she actually
Really,
judged people
totally
on
true,
their
totally
political
true.
beliefs or ideals, which is interesting.
I mean, I think she liked adventurous people like that, and that the person who is the black and tan. Actually, comes relevant to what's going on now. He was in World War One. He survived Gallipoli in World War One, like that massacre where all these people got killed. He was sent to Ireland. He became a black and tan. fighting for the British Empire, terrifying people from Ireland. But then he was a British police officer in Palestine, and he was wrote her letters about that, and basically trying to, and from his point of view, the British point of view, he was trying to stop Jews and Arabs from killing each other, basically. And some of the stuff that he wrote about that is kind of eerily, reminiscent of what's going on now. And it's interesting about that because, like, I have my own political prejudices, and I view, like, the British is quite responsible for what happened in the Middle East and for, all the problems there. And I still believe that. But reading his letter, Bill Barker was the guy's name, the Black and Tan guy. Reading his letters to my great aunt, I think, he sounds like a guy who really, really cared and really, really did his best. Even though he was working for a force that was bad, if not evil, he himself sounded like he really cared and wanted just to help and wanted peace. And,
Well, that's the thing. Even if you talk about Nazis, you have to remember there were a lot of people involved who were just everyday people.
True.
They might not have had a choice, or even if they wanted to serve, which you get that with the U.S. military. There's a lot of guys who go over and fight overseas in wars that they probably don't believe in. So what do if they don't believe in the war and they can't get out? They just try to do their best and try to help. Yeah. And, it's important to be a helper, and nobody wants to be the villain or see themselves as the villain. So, this guy's not going to, he doesn't want to see himself as a colonizer probably, even though
he doesn't.
After what they did to Ireland, like the British. So it's like, which is that might, I don't know how far you go into that, but that'd be an interesting juxtaposition too, is, if she was involved with an Irishman who was pretty much fighting colonialism, and then you have also she was involved with the colonizer.
No, what's funny about that is like that there is kind of like that, because that one of the things, like I should have mentioned this before, like got me going in this book, is that when my great aunt was like 17 years old, she wrote this book called Master Lovers of the World. It was this way over the top romantic versions of the lives of people like Henry VIII, Casanova, and Charles Parnell, who is a fighter for Irish independence around like 1890, turn of the last century. And she has this very romantic, view of Charles Parnell, which is probably pretty true. He probably was a pretty heroic guy. So like in her romantic book that she wrote, this Irish nationalist is portrayed in glowing terms, but later she hooks up with a Black and Tan. And I don't think she would ever have seen that. I think she was all into romance. Maybe she was into sex. I don't know. She must have been into sex, but she wasn't, that kind of contradiction didn't seem to bother her or occur to her.
Almost to a fault. If you ever wanted to go just full fiction, you could use her as like a James Bond character, because it is fitting, like just lovers all over the world, meeting all these men of intrigue. That could be a fun story too.
And martinis, start definitely.
A series,
yeah.
Then you'll make the millions. That's what you need to do.
Yeah.
People love their series.
They really do. This will probably be the most pretentious question I ask you. Going into this, because I know when I write stories, I generally don't go into it with this in mind. But what would you like the reader to take away from this, or what would you want them to take away from this book?
I want them to be just surprised. Like there's so many surprising things, like that this woman, this Jewish woman who seemed like she was, married to just one person, actually had this crazy other life, that all people's assumptions to get shattered, but also the closeness that she had. But my great aunt was also, a weird thing happened after World War II in like world of classical music, I gather. I was reading about this for this book, is that like there would be all these programs in which former Nazis would be playing with Jews who survived the Holocaust. And my great aunt was close with all these former Nazis. So surprises, I would say, the fact that how close that she could have been as a Jewish woman to fascists and Nazis, how she turned out not to be the person that at all who she seemed that she was, like that things just not being the way that they seem.
That makes one wonder how much derogatory, sentiments were thrown her way, because one, obviously that, but also just the implication of a woman in the 1930s. Now it's considered normal, but dating around, having affairs with married men, all these organizations that she was loosely or maybe even less loosely tied to because of the men. I could imagine she had to have had a lot of just shit come her way because of that. I don't see how that would be avoidable.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm sure you're absolutely right, but she never talked about stuff like that. She was really old school, and she did achieve a lot as a woman in an era in which women really were so prejudiced against. But she was one of those people you'd say like, "Wow, you did all this stuff, and you were in a woman in your era," and she'd like say poo-poo it like it didn't mean anything.
I mean, just to be a woman in that era, and then coming into World War II to be a Jewish woman in that era,
Right,
that's
right.
enough. Like that should
Yeah,
be
I know,
hard
I know.
enough.
I know. Yeah, somehow that was like a narrative that she never wanted to visit, even though that had to be the narrative in a lot of ways. Yeah, absolutely.
That's it's strange from 2024 taking a look back at that time because we're getting close to 100 years
Yes.
and we only have the modern lens to look through it, so everything is kind of black and white now. But like you said, you have a Jewish woman who's hanging around Nazis,
Yeah.
and if she wasn't in Germany during World War II or Poland or any of these places, she probably has a different view. I don't know what the propaganda was, how hard it was in the US at the time, but I could imagine like the things she had to go through would be hard, but at the same time, we're in the depression era, so everybody's worried about themselves too. So I don't know. It's just I'm rambling. I don't know exactly. I guess what I'm getting at is the world would not be what it is today without like the Nazis and people like that who are on the opposite side but still intermingling, because we just think of, oh, Nazis bad. It's not that black and white.
No.
We wouldn't
Mhm.
have the modern. I mean, a lot of the Nazi doctors came here. We used them as scientists and things like
Yeah.
that. Like the world we know it wouldn't be the same without that evil, and that's like such a terrible thing to think about. So when you have your aunt who was involved in all this stuff, but the world would not be what it is without people like her who were able to look past certain. I mean, Nazi. That's more than a
Yeah.
flaw if you're a
Yeah.
Nazi. Like I don't
Right.
care if you were just like, well, I lived there, I had to be a Nazi. Yeah, it's still shitty, man. Like it's
Yeah. Well,
terrible, but like you still needed people that be able to forgive or look past
well,
certain elements of people's character.
her thing was like she valued, and this is weird. I mean, I don't agree with this, but she was the queen of like what if there's every word for the opposite of cancellation or cancel culture. If there's some absolute polar opposite to that, I don't know whatever you even call that, but she would be the absolute opposite to that. If you were a great singer or a great conductor or a great composer or whatever, it didn't matter what you did to her. I mean, what you did in her eyes. It's just like the idea of any kind of connection between what somebody did and their art just didn't occur to her.
That's almost how some modern people view when they look at like spiritual connections they have with people, where it's you don't even really ask about their political beliefs or their ideals. You just almost meet them as a person, and you vibe with who they are as a person and the art they create and what they're passionate about. And then when you become friends or lovers or whatever with these kind of people, you are more likely to overlook some of the bad things that
Yeah.
do come up.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of faulty, but at the same time, it's like you using the lover example, you fell in love with the person and not their beliefs necessarily.
Right.
And then that's when
True.
you get into that odd separation of where do you like separate the artist from the art. Where do you separate the person from the beliefs? Like where
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, yeah.
well, we're getting close because I don't want you to miss your concert. So, if we could move away from the book for a little bit here
Sure.
before we get to the promotion stuff, I was interested as well as your editorial work.
Yes.
So, like the magazines, you're the senior editor at Statorec, and all does that entail? Are you actually like receiving submissions and doing that, or are you just covering the whole magazine and the
Great question.
operations?
Statorec is a very strange thing. It was founded by this guy John Reed, who actually runs the MFA program at the New School, And it was started originally as kind of like surreal joke. Like on its webpage, there are all this false information about it. He claimed it was started by Dorothy Parker in the 30s. That's just bullshit. I mean, and
It'd be
the
cool if it
problem,
was.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote these like blurbs, like the New York Times loving us, like Time Magazine's thing, we're the wildest thing, and it was all just a weird joke. And I loved those jokes, but it was a little hard to run a magazine. And he didn't, and this another woman, Andrea Stremas, her name, became the editor, and take basically turn this surreal joke into something very real. And my role in it is pretty much just what I want to do. I mean, we do get submissions. We're not the best at reading submissions. We're more likely to be like contacting writers and trying to get things published. It's funny. I mean, senior editor is a kind term that Andrea
Bestowed upon you. Yeah.
bestowed upon me. Exactly. It doesn't mean I'm not real. I am senior, but I'm not really an editor.
Well, you're the fiction editor for The American as well. Is that more hands-on than the other one?
It used to be. I mean, that's an odd story. I could like take you till like 2 years from now with that. That was founded by my great uncle, my father's much younger half brother. He's an American guy. He's lived all his life in Rome, and he always had the fantasy of probably, if you've ever seen that movie with Gregory Peck set in Rome, running and having an English language publication in Rome. And it eventually became this thing called The American. And for many years, I was responsible for coming up with finding a short story I liked every month. But that's kind of, unfortunately, my uncle's gone blind. The magazine does exist, and I actually published a new short story just a few weeks ago. But that's also not hugely demanding.
Right. Well, my follow-up question was going to be, as the fiction editor, what kind of work excites you or excited you when you would, what were you looking for?
Yeah, I mean,
see, I thought it was gonna be like, do you have an interest to get any of our work published? I thought that was gonna be the next one.
Well, I can say what I like, and what I don't like. Unfortunately, because the magazine is based in Rome, we get a lot of bad expat fiction, like people who like like, I don't know, Americans and Brits who've lived in Rome, and like they have people talking in Italian, and it's just like
a lot of lost generation knockoffs.
Yeah, it's but I mean, I want anything that surprises me. That's always my thing. Yeah,
I'm always interested when I speak to editors of what their process is when they review fiction, because so many are story first, but then you do get the rare one where it's like, well, I want a more James Joyce experimental, something that the reader's going to be blown away by but probably hate,
right,
because we get some quirky people we talk to as well who are just like outside of the box, and that has a place too. I appreciate that. But yeah, I think usually you want a good story first and foremost, because you want the reader to come back.
Right, exactly. Something that surprises me or surprises readers, but also catches their interest at the same time. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I guess we could do the promo stuff here because we're about 45 minutes. Of course, I don't know how short this will be once I cut out all my blabbering, but so Master Lovers, that came out at the end of last year, November,
exactly.
So that is available. I looked, that's on Amazon. You can get the Kindle and the actual paperback or whatever. So if you want to do the promo where people can find you, the social medias, the websites, the short story in The American, maybe a title.
Sure. Well, like I said, website is david-winner.com. If anybody's curious, you can find the book on Amazon or bookshop.org, or you can go at the Outpost 19 is the press that published it, a really great press, a great small press. You can go on Outpost 19 and find it there, and with outpost19.com, because they have this fabulous, strange list of books. So if somebody wants to look for my book, while they're doing it, they can find all these other interesting books, like the Charles Manson cutout coloring book written by John Reed, the founder of Staterek, which is an Outpost book put out a couple of years ago.
That sounds quite interesting. Yeah. I'm kind of curious as to see what that's about. Like, what does that entail inside of that? That's a weird thing.
Yeah, it's a weird book. Yeah.
All right. Well, we thank you for coming on. That was fun.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Oh, that's what I wanted to tell you. When I initially looked you up, it was just like a quick. I just looked up your name, an author, and I got recommended a bunch of books about like English football or something, and I think it was an old English guy. I was like, "Who the fuck is this?" I don't have any. I don't want to talk about football.
That's really funny. Like I have a doppelganger who's another David winner, about 10 years older than I am. And he's a famous writer in Europe because he wrote this book about Dutch soccer. And
even more obscure Dutch soccer.
Yeah. But believe it or not, it was a huge book. It's Brilliant Orange, I think it was called. And actually, weirdly enough, he and I, not friends, but we're Facebook friends and acquaintances. And I gave a reading when my previous book came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was during COVID. And so it was a, remote reading, and he attended, and people were really freaked out by the other David Winner in attendance at David Winner's reading. It was,
it can get confusing. I wouldn't want to be the master of ceremonies at that if you're both reading.
No.
Yeah,
did anybody scream, "There must be one. There can only be one.
There can only be one." Well, when I was looking at your books on Goodreads, again, a bunch of football books came up under your author profile because I think it just mashes it together.
Right.
That's annoying. Yeah. Like, I don't know what I would do.
I mean, it must be particularly annoying for him because, like I said, he's actually a famous writer. But he's kind. He doesn't seem to care. Yeah.
Well, that's I forget what it was, but I saw that there was another author called Stephen King.
Oh, yeah? Why?
You gotta change your name, dude.
Yeah,
you can't.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. Yeah. I mean,
it's bad enough if your actual name was King. Like, you'd still have, you know what I mean? Yeah. Even if it was just the last name, you'd still have to change that.
Well, I don't even think you go by Steve King, because I think there's some, fucking asshole far-right guy that's Steve King or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's that's just more confusing. Just S. King.
Yeah.
He changes his name to Bachman. I was like, that was a mistake. All right, folks. Well, that was fun. So
if really fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on because we need more guests who are interesting and actually have unique stories. Not disparaging any past guests. No. I just, I don't think people enjoy hearing us every single episode just talk to each other. I think they like to break it up with actual guests who have something worthwhile to say. Because every week, that's the problem with the weekly podcast.
You run out of stuff.
You run out of stuff. So if you want to check out our work, which I don't think we ever really post, but we do post some stuff at DPW Podcast on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Spencer's OnlyFans. I'm looking at it because it's a fucking mouthful. The Tennessee Toblerone Tyrant Church. Again, I don't know the Tyrant. Some of these are fan suggested. So I didn't say they were good suggestions, and then they stopped listening because they besmirched their name. If you want to check out my work, my publication history, calebjamesk.com. I think I got new stuff coming. I can't remember. I should probably keep up on that. But anyway, next week, as of now, we have guests in queue, but I haven't responded in weeks, which I probably should because that makes me look like a douche not doing so. But as of now, next week should be just a normal episode, maybe even a DBS episode. We're overdue. Yeah, so a less serious episode. If you don't want to tune in, that's fine as well. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we will check you out next week. Bryce, what are you doing?
Trying to, game.
What?
This game is really hard.
Pac-Man?
Yeah.
Dude, you're supposed to be playing the game for next week's episode of Arcade Bookshop.
I mean, I will. I'm really close to beating this.
Right. And what about the book?
Huh?
We're supposed to finish a book for the podcast, too?
Oh, yeah. I finished that last week. Yes!
Oh, did you finally beat it?
Uh-huh. The first level.
Oh, boy.
Listen up now. When the leave on, get ready for an arcade bookshop. With your ball, play a game, check it out. Don't be lame. Listen up now. believe on, get ready for Arcade Bookshop.
Hey guys, it's your host, Bryce Yulee. If you're at all interested in reading, I hope you'll try my new book, Airplane Graveyard, my first small collection of poetry. Airplane Graveyard retraces the path that brought us here and questions the way forward. These poems work through the redefining of masculinity in our living era. What can we keep? What should we change? How can we be sure? These questions are framed in the death of the family dog, getting married, wanting children, and in many memories of the speaker's family, particularly his Vietnam War veteran father. Airplane Graveyard is available for pre-order now. If you place an order before July 19th, you'll get $2 off the typical list price. I know poetry isn't everybody's thing, but I personally feel that mine isn't dense or prompting you to bash your head off the wall, but rather simple to understand, and I hope you'll give it a try. If you decide to place an order, be sure to email proof of your pre-order to arcadebookshop@gmail.com, and I will send you 5 Arcade Bookshop stickers for free. You can listen to new episodes of Arcade Bookshop every other Monday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your pods. You'll always find us with a controller in one hand and a book in the other.
Believe on, get ready for Arcade Bookshop.
Hey Caleb, you wanted to see me?
Ah, Spencer, my good fellow. I've been expecting you.
Yeah, so did you want something or
Want? Goodness, no. Require.
require?
Yes. I require your services for the briefest of moments.
Okay.
Surely you can see the predicament I'm in.
Well, actually, no, I can't. I lost my glasses at the pub last night.
A pub, you say? Surely you can't be serious.
As serious as a fought during a recto, cause I am. And stop calling me Shirley.
Rightio. Anyway, if your spectacles were affixed upon your face, you'd see that I, the host of the most prodigious writing and books podcast in the business, has been immobilized by a rather substantial stack of fallen folios.
What?
My to-read pile finally fell on me while I was taking a nap.
But you're on a podcast table.
I hardly see how that matters.
And you're naked.
I hardly see how that matters.
Dude, your hairy ass is touching my drink coaster.
I hardly see how that matters.
It matters to me.
Can you just unbury me?
No way. Your reckless reading got you into this mess.
Blockhead! Wait! Don't go! There's a copy of War and Peace wedged in my taint. Spencer! Can you at least leave me a bottle of whiskey? Hello? Can't get enough drunken nonsense? Listen to new episodes of the Drunken Pen Writing Podcast every Tuesday wherever you get your pods.